There's one thing you can do that will increase your hunting success more than almost anything else. We're going to talk about it today on the Persistence Outdoors podcast. Hey guys, Samuel Allred here. Welcome back to the Persistence Outdoors podcast. When I look back on my successful hunts, there's one common factor that stands out. When I've been successful, I've almost always had prior knowledge of the area I was hunting. It's pretty simple, right? But it makes a huge difference. When I first started hunting, I went on many unsuccessful hunts. And often, I wouldn't even see any animals at all. In many ways, it felt like hunting was just a game of dumb luck. Well, of course, there's an element of luck involved, but that's not the end of the story. As a certain NFL quarterback likes to say, the separation is in the preparation, and that's totally true for hunting. Successful hunters spend a lot of time scouting. Scouting is simply studying an area that you want to hunt. There's different ways to do it, but you're trying to discover anything that will help you hone in on where the animals are and where you can kill them. Sometimes it's as simple as looking for animals from your car. Other times it involves analyzing maps, hiking into the woods, and checking poop to see if it's fresh. Scouting is different than hunting in that you're not necessarily carrying a gun, and stealth is less important. It's okay if you bump a few animals, and in fact, doing so will give you valuable intel for when the season rolls around. And that's the other thing, you can scout any time of year. If you're planning to hunt a short 2-week elk season, for example, you can give yourself a major advantage by scouting and locating elk before the season starts. So today, we're going to talk about how to scout and become more successful on your hunts. We'll talk about in-person scouting and e-scouting. We'll talk about what you're actually looking for, and we'll talk about putting it all together to make a plan. Before we get into it, please take a moment to follow the podcast and leave a 5-star rating on whatever platform you listen on. This will help the podcast grow, and together we will help more people get outside and into hunting. With that, let's jump in. So I touched on this in the intro, but I want to start out with why you should scout in the first place. One reason you need to scout is because you need to narrow down the area you're hunting. Think about a given tract of land. Say it's public land near where you live or your neighbor's farm that you're going to hunt. If you think about it, animals aren't spread out evenly throughout the land. There are going to be pockets of animals in different parts, and then they are going to travel on their own little routes. But if you were just to drop a pin on any part of that tract of land, chances are an animal isn't going to be there. So you actually need to narrow down before you start hunting where the animals are going to be concentrated. And that's going to help you be much more successful. Another reason why you might want to scout is that it saves you time during the season. So like I said, if you have a 2-week elk season, you want to spend all the time you can actually being near elk and actually trying to make a play on them. If you start the beginning of that season and you have no idea where the elk are, it could take you a long time to even find the elk, and then you might not have enough time to actually make a play on them. But with scouting, you can do it before the season. You can come, the week before your season. You could even come a month before the season and start understanding where the elk hang out and where they travel. And this can be especially important in heavily pressured hunting areas. When there are lots of people competing to kill animals, those first couple days of the season can be critical. And so if you've scouted and you know where the animals will be on the morning of that opening day, you've put yourself at a huge advantage over all of these other hunters who are rolling in the night before. The third reason to scout is that it will help you learn the lay of the land. This will help you find animals for sure, but it will also help you plan your travel routes. It can help you plan where you are going to camp, and it just makes everything easier once you're actually out there hunting. You're not taking in new information every time you go to a certain spot. Instead, you've done it before, you know how to get around, and you can focus on being stealthy and actually connecting with an animal. If you decide to scout, there's a couple different ways to do it. The traditional way is in person. So you will drive out to the land that you want to hunt, you will hike in, and you'll just look for sign and look for animals, start learning the lay of the land on foot. More recently, e-scouting has become a thing. And e-scouting typically involves looking at aerial imagery and maps to get an idea of where animals might be on the land that you want to hunt. We're going to start by talking about in-person scouting. There's lots of different ways to scout in person. The first way, and one very common way, is to just go drive around the unit that you want to hunt. If you're lucky, you'll see some animals, and that will be useful information. You'll also get the lay of the land and start understanding just how much of an area you can hunt, what the different topography is like, and be able to orient yourself from there. While driving can be useful and certainly has its place, it's also important to get out and hike around. So some places that I hunt are so thick that you can drive, but you really can't see much from the roads. And in order to discover useful information, you really need to get out of the truck and take a hike. And I think this is actually true in most situations. Unless you have a very specific goal for driving in mind, it would probably benefit you more to get out and look around. Another way that you can cover ground is by biking, like mountain biking or using an electric bike. This can be very helpful when you're just trying to go fast and see country that isn't accessible by car. And then a fourth way to scout in person is to glass. So if you know there's a good spot where you can sit and have a view of a large swath of land in your hunting unit, it may be worth it to drive or hike up there and spend some time glassing. And even if you spot animals from miles and miles away, that can still be valuable information because you can mark it on a map and then come at them from a different direction during the hunting season. Now, when you go scouting, it's helpful to understand what you're actually looking for. So, number one, of course, is animals. If you see the animal you want to hunt, that's a huge confidence boost, and it's a good sign for the hunting season. Most of my success has been in places where I've gone scouting and seen animals, and I'm like, sweet, they live here, I can probably hunt them. Now, you won't always see animals when you're scouting. Maybe you go out in the middle of the day and the animals just aren't active, but you know it's a likely place for them to live. Well, you can also look for sign. So sign includes scat, which is just animal poop. It includes rubs and scrapes, tracks, beds, anything that an animal leaves behind indicating their presence. Another good one is browsed bushes. If you're looking for deer, you can find places where bushes have been nibbled off at deer height, I don't know, waist height, and you can tell that the deer have been feeding there, and it's a good indicator that there's a food source. Sign is super helpful to understand where animals are, what type of animals are there, where they're going, all of that. One thing I do need to caution you about, though, is that one animal can leave a lot of sign. So you could go out and find 10,000 deer tracks, right? And that could just be one deer walking a very long route. And so you have to look for an abundance of sign. You also want sign coming from a lot of different animals. And when you're getting closer to hunting season and even actually in hunting season, it's really important to pay attention to fresh sign. If you're seeing lots of old sign, it tells you an animal was there, but it may not be at all helpful because the animal has moved on and they're not in your area anymore. So definitely look at sign and pay attention, but really keep an eye out for that fresh sign. And personally, I don't really stop moving for sign until I see something that's fresh. In addition to animals and sign, you should look for food, shelter, and water. Any animal needs these things to survive. And if you can find a scarcity of one of these things, it's a great way to hone in on where the animals are going to be. So, for example, say you're hunting in a unit that is covered in shelter and water. There's streams everywhere and there's tall, mature trees everywhere. A lot like some places where I hunt in Idaho. Well, the scarcity might be food, places in the forest where the sun can reach the forest floor and actually grow some plants that deer or elk or bears might like to eat. Or let's say you live in a high desert. Well, in a desert environment, water might be a limiting factor, or even shelter because it's just so wide and open. So if you can find that scarcity, suddenly you have a great place to start looking. But let's take a moment to break each of these down. So food is obviously species dependent. If you're looking for elk, they have slightly different diets than deer. And deer have much different diets than bears. And so you need to understand the animal that you're hunting. But there are some generalities. So in general, animals like tender, young green growth, and they like foods that are calorie rich. And so they might like buds coming off a woody plant, or they might like young green grasses, or they especially enjoy mast crops like acorns or berries or fruits growing on trees. And so you can start to understand the things that animals are going to key into versus the things that they're going to leave behind. Now, obviously, to survive, they're going to have to eat all sorts of different types of foods, but almost every animal is going to prefer certain types of foods over other foods. So, for example, if a deer knows there's acorns available, it's going to prefer that over its normal diet of browse. And if a bear knows there's huckleberries available, it's definitely going to focus on those huckleberries because they have all those sugars and calories that it needs to store up fat for the winter. This is super helpful to understand while scouting, because if you can find a food source that the animals seem to prefer, you're in the money. It's kind of like offering a donut and a salad to a little kid. Like they could eat the salad for sure, but they're always going to choose the donut. And animals tend to be the same way. Let's talk about shelter. Animals need shelter to stay safe from predators and to stay safe from the elements. So animals will find places that are advantageous to them to avoid predators. So a good example is male deer. They like to bed on a point on a ridge where they can get the wind coming at their back, and then they can look and see in front of them a good ways. And so if a predator comes up behind them, they can smell it. And if something comes up in front of them, they can either see it or hear it crashing through brush, and they can get out of there before the predator or hunter has a chance to attack them. Their other need for shelter, staying out of the elements, means that they'll find places that have big trees that can shelter them from wind and rain and snow. Large pine stands, for example, or conifer forests can also regulate temperature underneath the canopy to help animals stay cool in the summer or stay warm in the winter. And so animals are always searching for these places where they can bed down and not have to worry about getting jumped or freezing their butts off. Sometimes shelter is obvious, like once again, if you're in a high desert area and there is a big stand of trees, that would be a great place to look for animals. Other times, you're looking for a very specific type of shelter. So in North Idaho, everything is shelter because there's trees everywhere. But then you're actually trying to look for a certain type of forest that the animals are going to prefer over other places that they can shelter. The third element that is essential to animal survival is water. I can't overstate the importance of water. It seems like some animals have adapted to go without water for a time or be able to travel long distances without water. But what I've found is that animals prefer to be near water if it's available. And usually water is just a source of life. It means that there is going to be new growth, it's going to be green and fresh, and animals can drink whenever they want. If you're trying to find a place to hunt, it's always a good bet to start near the water. So if you can find food, shelter, and water, you're probably in the game. But there are other features that you want to look out for as well. In the wild, animals want to take the easiest travel route possible. And it's not just because they're lazy, it's because they actually need to do this in order to survive. They need to be efficient and use their calories the best way possible. And so they're always going to look for the easiest route to travel. In steep country and mountainous country, and even not super steep country, the easiest routes are often going to be on ridges. And so if an animal really needs to cover some ground, they're going to get up on a ridge and follow that ridge to their destination. That's because a ridge has a gentler slope. It may be longer than going straight up the side of the mountain, but to get to a top of a mountain, a long sloped ridge is a better option. You might also look at an area and see a notch in a ridge or a space between two high points in a mountain range. And these places are called saddles. And anytime there's a saddle, there's a good chance that an animal will prefer going through that saddle instead of going over one of the high points on either side of it. You can also find benches, and benches are places where the slope flattens out, shallows out, and it creates a place along a slope that is kind of like a bench, a place where it's flatter and animals can travel more easily. So say there's a steep south-facing slope, but around the middle of it, there's a place where it flattens out a little bit and then goes back down. It's kind of like a terrace. Well, then animals could travel from east to west along that slope on that little flat part much easier than they could higher or lower on the slope where it's still super steep. So all of these places that make it easier for animals to travel and exist are good places to take note of. And you'll start to find that even in not mountainous country, even in flatter country, small changes in the topography can very much influence where the animals are. So, for example, I was hunting deer in Tennessee with a crossbow, and I have one distinct memory of sitting on the edge of a field, and I only had limited range, right? So I had tried to position myself where I thought the deer would enter the field. And it turned out I was wrong. They didn't come in through the little corner I thought they would. Instead, they entered along this tiny ridge that fed into the field from the, I want to say, east side. And at first, I didn't know why they had come out there. But then when I looked back at the maps and thought about it, they were probably able to see the entire field from that place where they entered because it was just a little bit higher. It was maybe 5 to 10 feet in elevation higher than where I was posted up at the edge of the field. And that would have given them a commanding view of the otherwise flat landscape. So animals do things like this all the time. They're finding places that are easy to travel and that give them even the slightest advantage in their everyday movements. Okay, let's do a quick recap. When you're scouting, you're looking for animals, you're looking for sign, you're looking for food, shelter, and water, and you're also paying attention to land features that will affect the way the animals move. Now, there is one other thing that I'm going to pay attention to, and that's access. Sometimes you find a great potential place to hunt, but it's very hard to get to. Either it's surrounded by private land that you can't cross, or maybe there's physical barriers like a very steep cliffed out slope or a river. So when I'm scouting, I'm also trying to find routes in and out of the places that I want to hunt, and also just roads that are nearby that can allow me to drive in closer or park my car and start my trip from there. Now, you can also use access or the lack of access to your advantage. So if you hunt in a heavily pressured area and you find a way to access a place that other people generally won't access or can't access, maybe they're not willing to make the hard hike to get into that area. Or maybe they're not willing to ask the private landowner for permission to drive or walk over the private property. If you can find places like this, you have a good chance at having an unpressured area to hunt. Let's move on to talk about e-scouting. E-scouting typically means using an app like onX Hunt to view maps and aerial imagery to help you understand the area you want to hunt. So onX Hunt, if you're not familiar, is an extremely popular mapping app. It gives you information like private and public land boundaries. It shows you aerial imagery. It shows you topography lines. You can measure distances. And when you're actually in the field, it acts as a GPS so you can always know where you're at. It's an incredible app. I recommend it to all new hunters because it's one of the few things that you can buy and use that will actually increase your hunting success. You could buy a new rifle, you could buy a lighter sleeping bag, all these things, and they might give you a marginal advantage, but onX Hunt for something like $35 a year is going to be incredibly useful and will actually help you become more successful. Now, if you don't want to buy onX Hunt for whatever reason, that doesn't mean you're out of the e-scouting game. There are other tools out there like Google Earth that aren't going to cost you anything, and those can help you get valuable information as well. And often when I'm using onX Hunt, I'm actually going to cross-reference the aerial imagery from onX with aerial imagery from Google Earth so that I can see if there's anything that's changed. Sometimes one service just has better imagery than the other, and I can tell if a road is open or if it's closed off and overgrown, things like that. So let's start with why you would e-scout in the first place. Why would you use maps and aerial imagery to scout instead of scouting in person? Well, there's a few reasons. First of all, you can cover way more ground. So if you're looking at a giant unit, chances are you can't walk across the entire unit, and you may not even be able to drive the whole unit in a day, right? So using aerial imagery helps you understand what's there without actually having to walk in. That's a huge time saver, and it's an obvious advantage. You can also e-scout at any time. You don't have to physically go to the place you're hunting to e-scout. You can just open your maps while you're sitting on your couch at home. You can open your app and look at maps and start gathering important information that you'll use later when you actually go to hunt. Sometimes you might be hunting places that are very far away. Maybe your hunting area is 5 or 6 hours away from you, and you just don't have time to go out and scout before the season starts. Well, that doesn't mean you have to show up blind, not knowing anything about where you're hunting. Instead, you can open your mapping app and start learning the topography, start looking at the aerial imagery, and actually have a good idea of what you're getting into before you show up on opening day. I don't think e-scouting completely replaces in-person scouting, but it is an important skill for modern hunters. And people who get really good at e-scouting can start to predict where animals will be and where they will travel just by looking at maps and aerial imagery. And if you can do that without even putting boots on the ground in the area you want to hunt, you're going to put yourself way ahead of everybody else. So, what are you looking for when you're e-scouting? Well, you're not going to see individual animals or sign, of course, but you can still identify food, shelter, and water, and you can also identify topographical features. Let's use an easy example. So, say you are a whitetail hunter and you can hunt agricultural land. So, there are these large fields that are full of corn or soybeans or some other crop. And you know that deer like to eat those crops. So you open up your aerial imagery on your maps, you look at your hunting area, and you locate a big cut field. Okay, now you know where a food source is. So then you look around the field, and not far away is a small stream. Okay, now you have food and water. At this point, all you have to find is shelter. So you keep looking around and you see dark green, tall trees. Boom, that's your shelter. That's a place where deer can go and get some protection from the elements. They can travel through there unseen from outside of that forest. And without even setting foot in the area, you've already found a likely place to kill deer. This does require a little bit of practice. You're going to have to understand what something on an aerial imagery map is indicating. So for example, I spend a lot of time trying to find places where green grass will grow for bears to eat. And for a while, I was looking at green slopes on my aerial imagery. But I started to find that when I went to hunt these green slopes in person, it turned out that they were just covered in small bushes and it wasn't actually green grass. Well, what I found is that places where green grass will grow typically show up as a brown or tan on aerial imagery maps, just because of the time of year when the photos are taken. So it takes a while to start understanding what you're actually looking at. Big agricultural fields are easy because they're usually going to be round or rectangular. Large stands of mature trees tend to be a little bit easier because it's going to be dark green. Sometimes you can see big individual trees. There is a lot of variability when it comes to just brushy slopes, but the more you start using your aerial imagery, and then also when you are out hunting, relating what you're seeing on the map to the landscape around you, you'll start to get a feel for it and you'll get better and better. Another thing you should look at is the topography. So in onX Hunt, there is a way that you can switch the map view to a topographical map, or you can have one that's a topographical map overlaid on aerial imagery. And that's the one I use the most. With a topographical map, you can start to identify ridges, valleys, benches, and saddles. So all of those different topographical features we talked about, you can identify without actually seeing them in person. So for example, you could find a saddle by finding two little high points right next to each other. And in between those high points, you will see the saddle. Or if you're looking at a steep slope, the topographical lines will be very close to each other. But in a place where the topo lines are further apart, that's going to be a shallower, less steep part of the slope. And boom, you've found yourself a bench. Or ridges and valleys will be sharp V's in the topographical lines. And so you can start narrowing down where animals are likely to be just by looking at a map. In addition to the normal aerial imagery and the topographical map features, there are also different map layers that you can toggle on and off in an app like onX Hunt. So one of the most useful map layers is the private public land layer, and this will show you the boundaries between private and public land. And so you can go out and confidently hunt on public land and always know that you're not trespassing on private land. Some of my favorite layers are the timber cut layer, the recent fire layer, and the slope angle layer. The timber cut layer and the recent fire layer are very useful for finding potential food sources for animals. When a logging company comes in and cuts timber, it creates an area in a forest that allows sunlight to hit the ground, and all of a sudden you will get new green growth over the next few years. And that's the same story with a fire. Anytime a forest fire comes through, for the next 3 to 7 to 10 years, you will get new growth in the place that was burned by the forest fire. And these places are just magnets for animals. And especially if the area is just covered in timber, these are some of the only open areas where the animals can come through and feed. So if you use the timber cut or the recent fire layer in onX, you can quickly identify potential food sources that you can hunt. The slope angle layer I reference all the time when I'm looking at a new area. It can be hard to get a good idea of what the topographical lines actually indicate. And so using that slope angle layer can show me quickly if the area is relatively shallow and flat, or if it's very steep and even dangerous. And it helps me plan my routes and also determine where the animals are most likely to be hanging out. So if you've got a mapping app, spend some time playing around with the different layers. Get familiar with them and see what they can show you, and soon you'll have a much better understanding of the area you're planning to hunt. The final step of the process is to put it all together. I think the best hunters will use a combination of e-scouting and in-person scouting to be successful. Usually you want to e-scout first to cover lots of ground and narrow down your unit, and then you can start marking spots on your map that you think are promising. Next, you'll actually go out to the hunting unit and do in-person scouting, where you hike into the areas that you think are promising and verify that there's animals there, or there's lots of sign, or whatever you saw on the map corresponds with what's on the ground. This is actually a really good hunting tactic that I've used before in places that I can't scout in person. So this fall, I was deer hunting. I was hunting in a new area that I had never been, but I spent an hour e-scouting before I went out to hunt. So I marked some places on my map that looked promising, and then on the day of the hunt, I just went and kept checking those different places. And my first spot wasn't as good in person as it looked on the map. So instead of spending more time there, I just went to my next spot. And at my next spot, I actually killed a deer. So it's a very effective way to kind of combine e-scouting and boots on the ground intelligence. One thing you need to keep in mind when you're analyzing what you've learned from scouting in making a plan is that you're not only looking for a place that has animals, but you're also looking for a place where you can kill and retrieve animals. So I've spent some time spring bear hunting, and I've had instances where I've glassed up bears a very long distance away. And even though I can locate them, I can't actually get to them because there's thousands of feet of elevation or a river or cliffs in between us. And so when you're making a hunt plan, you need to keep this in mind. Where can you actually position yourself to successfully kill and retrieve animals? And then finally, when you're planning where to go, make sure to come up with 2 or 3 different places. Maybe you go to your first spot and for whatever reason, the animals just aren't showing up. Well, you can back out and go to your plan B. Or maybe you show up to your spot and another hunter is already there. Well, you want to be respectful of that, and so having a plan B can save your hunt. All right, guys. Well, I think that's it for today. I hope this episode has been helpful for you and has helped you understand how scouting can make you more successful when you hunt. If you have any questions, as always, feel free to drop a comment or send me a message via Instagram. I'm happy to answer those, and I really appreciate your feedback. With that, I will wrap this up. I hope you all have a great week, and I will catch you on the next one.